the sense because our partners would have that in the back of their minds when conducting discussions and addressing the issue. Is Turkey a different partner now than it was before? Or is the sort of, is there a possibility that some of these reforms might not stay?
I think an important preface to your answer is that gazing in the crystal ball is a pretty hard thing. I served at our embassy in Moscow during the perestroika years, 1987 to 1990, and I can assure you that at least until early 1990, no one in that embassy was predicting the breakup of the Soviet Union, the breakup of the Soviet bloc. Foresight is, hindsight is always 20/20. Foresight is a little bit harder, and so take everything I say with a gigantic grain of salt. I think take what anybody says with a gigantic grain of salt, because I think the future at the end of the day is kind of unknowable. Some of these changes are obviously here to stay. Turkey is a more urban country, and barring gigantic climate change or some other set of catastrophes, I don't see that aspect of Turkish society changing. The transformation of the economy, I think, is a substantial accomplishment that is more likely to endure than not, but it requires adept policy making that has persisted. I mean, the basic economic, the outlines of the basic economic plan were those of Kemal Dervish, but the government, the AK government and Ali Babacan in particular, have continued that. They've built on it, they've expanded on it, and they've done that thing which in government is the single hardest thing to do. They have implemented. And it's easy in government to come up with smart policies. It's a lot harder to make them happen and carry them out. I think your real question gets, is on the political side. And there, at the end of the day, as I tried to suggest in my prepared remarks, the outcome is not clear. The destination, the end point of the changes that are underway in Turkish society and in Turkish politics, I think are highly, it's highly uncertain. And it doesn't have so much to do with, in my mind, with the specific aspirations of the AK party or Prime Minister Erdogan or any set of specific political leaders. These are underlying trends. And I don't know exactly how those things play out, in part because the social, economic, and political changes are themselves unleashing forces whose influence on Turkish society, as in anywhere else in the world, over the course of the next 20, 30, 50 or more years, I just think is kind of hard to know. And so for me, as a practitioner, as a policymaker, the challenge, the more important issue, you need to study, academics need to study the where are we going challenge, or where is Turkey going challenge. The issue for policymakers is, what are the policies that the United States and the West can pursue so as best to be able to work with Turkey, and I would say the same about almost any other country, so best to be able to work with Turkey in the future and to maximize the commonalities to preserve the long-term interests that we have and the values that we have as in terms of how Turkish society, how Turkish politics plays out. But at the end of the day, I don't know. Probably the best answer I can give.
I am Arivalji from Sakarya University, and thank you very much for your presentation. And it seems that the Arab uprisings will change the terms of region, and of course it's a developing story, but I was wondering that what do you think about the effects of Arab uprising on Turkish-American relations?
The question was about the Arab uprisings having what the sort of effect it might have on US-Turkey relations.
Let me break that into two pieces. The effect of the Arab uprisings. Again, like as with the previous question, ultimately unknowable. I mean, history is playing itself out before our eyes, and I think it's very difficult to see, 2 or 3 weeks in the future, much less a couple of years. But the effects are dramatic. I at least personally am very concerned about the potential economic effects of this. It's not just the American economy that depends on oil that comes from the Persian Gulf, and which in turn depends on stability in that part of the world. It's the whole world economy that depends on that. And so a continuing spread of upheaval, I think, can have extremely serious and potentially extremely negative consequences for the world and the world economy, and I would include Turkey, which is far more dependent on imported energy than the United States. On the political side, clearly one has to be and should be happy when people successfully throw off autocrats and take in their own hands their country's destiny a little bit. But I think that the challenges now that face Egypt, in particular Egypt, because it's the most important country in the Arab world, but I'd say the same about Tunisia, Bahrain, depending on how things develop, Yemen, depending on how things develop, Syria, depending on how things develop. The challenges that face Egypt are immense. And they don't have a lot to fall back on. They're extremely difficult compromises now that are going to have to be worked out and developed. They're formulating new institutions. I don't know how all that's going to work. I can imagine a whole lot of scenarios in which it turns out badly for Egypt, and badly for the Middle East, and badly for the world. I can think of somewhat fewer scenarios where it turns out well, and I think the challenge that all of us have is to try to reinforce those positive trends, and as best outsiders can help the Egyptian people and Egyptian institutions to minimize the negative ones. And that's, I think, the segue to U.S.-Turkish, the effects here on U.S.-Turkish relations. The Western response to developments, going back to the Tunisian revolts, the Western response, I think, by and large, has been uncertain and confused, or certainly at the beginning was uncertain and confused. And I frankly would kind of say the same about Turkey. I mean, I think the world generally has kind of initially had a hard time, and to some extent still does, in figuring out and uncertain how to react and what are going to be the implications. And I think a reflection of that is, you had on the one hand Turkey's prime minister sort of in a very forthright way calling for Mubarak to step down, but took a vastly more conservative approach in the early days of the Libyan revolt, out of concern about, I think, legitimate concern about the implications for the tens of thousands of Turks who were there, for Libya as a whole, for the international economy as a result of disruptions in oil markets and other markets, and for a variety of other factors. What's interesting is that eventually, and I think in part as a result of a lot of conversations at high levels, the United States and Turkey have come into a reasonable level of harmony. We're reasonably in sync now. And on the side of, more on the side of participatory political systems, pluralistic political systems that in some significant ways reflect the will of the citizenry and the will of the voters, as opposed to as opposed to the autocrats of the past. But they're very difficult things to work on and to work out now. And to make a point I didn't make earlier, but this is a good opportunity to do so, the sort of geographic divide in the ways that the United States deals with the world make it more complicated and harder to work issues in the Middle East between the United States and Turkey. To be specific, Turkey is part of the European Bureau at the State Department, or U.S.-Turkish relations are dealt with out of the European Bureau at the State Department. Turkey is dealt with through the U.S. European Command in the military scheme of things. And if you walk around the U.S. government, by and large, you find the same thing. And the Middle East is dealt with by the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs and by the director at the NSC, by the director for Near Eastern Affairs. At the Pentagon, it's CENTCOM, so U.S. Central Command. And so the people who are working on the Middle East, Turkey is not their thing. You know, in a sense, they don't care. I mean, they do care, but in a certain sense, Turkey, for them, might as well be in Latin America. It's not part of what they do. It's not their day-to-day jobs. They can't send instructions. To be sort of put it in bureaucratic terms, the Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs can't send an instruction to our ambassador in Ankara and say, do this. Instructions come from the Assistant Secretary for Europe. And so working across that divide is one of the important things for U.S. policymakers to try to come to grips with. Things are working better now because the conversations are Secretary Clinton, Ahmed Dawood, or Undersecretary Burns, Undersecretary Senator Hogan. As you get back to sort of the normal day-to-day ways in which our countries relate to one another, these bureaucratic impediments will become more significant. I thought it was very helpful that Turkey sent 3 or 4 of its deputy undersecretaries to Washington just a month or so ago for in-depth conversations with their geographic counterparts at State, at Defense, at the NSC, and elsewhere, because they're the ones that actually have to work together. If we're not having those conversations, problems almost inevitably arise.
So we'll take one last question, yes.
A couple of weeks ago, I read that, like the total, you said that you were very concerned about the potential economic effects of these current uprisings, and especially the negative ones. And I have read that the total oil production in the world is 80 million barrels per day. And Libya only supplies 1.6 million barrels per day. And the OPEC countries, and especially Saudi Arabia, said that it would supply an additional 4 million barrels per day in order to fill this gap that Libya wouldn't supply. And I'm an economist myself, like I'm trying to develop my expertise on international political economy, and I know about the role of expectations and so forth, but still, it makes me wonder, what's really going on? Because like we read, we experience, and we hear about those rising oil prices. So these are the statistics, the numbers.
Yeah,
So.
I know. All I know is gasoline has gone from about $3 to $4 a gallon.
Yeah.
International oil prices have gone. What was it in December? $60, $70, something like that. It's 100, 115, 120, my economic counselor in Ankara had the math, and I've forgotten what the numbers were now, but he had it figured out for every dollar increase in the price of oil, Turkey's current account deficit, all other things being equal, increases by Y. And I don't remember what that was. It was hundreds of millions of dollars. It's a lot of money for Turkey and by extension for everybody else. So the issue ends up, in a market economy, the issue is not supplies or per se. The issue is the price and people's expectations about future trends. Yes, of course, Libya is a relatively small player, but prices get formed on the margins. Prices are made on the margins. And I think to the extent that what is happening in Libya spreads, the withdrawal of Iraqi supplies, the withdrawal of Iranian supplies, the withdrawal of Saudi supplies from international markets could have a huge and direct catastrophic effect. But even just the inching up of prices goes back to $150, $170, $200 a barrel, and there are people who are talking about $200 a barrel, which trajectory we were on anyway before, before the financial crisis sort of slowed the growth of demand, around the world. That is a huge burden. Will be a huge burden. The United States economy probably better able to bear it than a lot of others, including because we have our own resources. A huge burden for a country like Turkey, a huge burden for countries in Africa that are already struggling, countries in Asia that are already struggling, Latin America. And that's what I'm talking about. I mean, in gross terms, there's plenty of oil. The problem is these price effects that crises and then the expectations and fears about the future that crises generate that I think is and should be a big concern.
Mr. Ambassador has given us a lot of things to think about and discuss all throughout the day, but he can't be with